My name is Bridget Duplantis. I am the chief of our leasing and financial responsibility section at BOEM in our Gulf of Mexico region. I'm also serving as the project coordinator for the Central Atlantic Renewable Energy Projects. So for my portion of the talk today, I'm going to start with an overview of BOEM's leasing process. We'll also discuss the summary of the completed steps that we have accomplished so far. I'll also go over some of the responses that we received to our recently published call for information and nominations. And then I'll discuss the milestones and the path forward. So BOEM's leasing process consists of 4 distinct phases. We have the planning and analysis phase, leasing, site assessment, and construction and operations. Currently, the Central Atlantic is in the very beginning, and we're in the first phase of the planning and analysis. So if we expand on just that first phase, on that planning and analysis phase, you can see that we have a lot of different steps within that planning and analysis phase. So the Central Atlantic started with a draft call for information. Then we published a call for information and nominations, followed by a 60-day comment period for stakeholder engagement. And now we're in the area identification portion of this phase that's indicated by the red button there. In order to increase our transparency and to have additional stakeholder engagement, we recently created a draft wind energy area portion of this phase as well. So that's what we are doing right now. The Central Atlantic region begins offshores Delaware and goes all the way south to Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, and it extends out to about 2,500 meters in depth. The different color polygons you see on the map to your right is all of our current active wind energy leases. So the first thing we did with the Central Atlantic was to take that entire region and remove some of the low-hanging fruit based on some of the data that we had. Basically removing no-go areas that we knew that we needed to just remove in the very beginning of the process. This included the shelf break. We removed a sea scallop rotational area, a NASA danger zone, and as well as the Atlantic canyons and the submarine navigational lanes. So the, I'm sorry, go back one. So the Central Atlantic planning area ended up being 3 separate regions labeled 1, 2, and 3, and it encompassed 5.8 million acres, which was a 54.3% reduction from the Central Atlantic region. We took this planning area to our stakeholders for comment. We held virtual meetings with each of the 4 affected states, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, and Delaware. We also consulted with our federal partners at Coast Guard, NOAA, NASA, Fish and Wildlife, and DoD. We also solicited feedback at 8 informational meetings during this process. So we met with the maritime industry, tribal governments, environmental organizations. We had 4 sector-based fishery meetings, and we also met with the offshore wind energy developers. And those meetings took place in December of 2021 and January of this year. We took all of the comments that we received during all of the informational meetings and the engagement meetings and all of our virtual meetings, and we winnowed down the area into our draft call for information and nominations area, which you could see in the map to the right. This encompasses 4 million acres and was a 68.5% reduction from the region and a 31% reduction from the planning area that I showed earlier. So we took this draft call for information to our Central Atlantic Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Task Force meeting that we held in February of this year in order to get additional stakeholder input. After that meeting, we considered the comments that we received and winnowed down the area just a little bit further. And what we actually published as the call for information and nominations is the map on this slide. There are 6 call areas labeled A, B, C, D, and then the deep water areas are E and F. The entire call area encompasses 3.9 million acres. And we published this in the Federal Register on April 29th of this year. We had a 60-day comment period, which closed June 28th, and we received 66 comments. We also received 3 companies submitting nominations. So the 3 companies that did submit nominations in the Central Atlantic were Avangrid, US Mainstream, and Ocean Winds. We received 33 nominated areas, which you can see on this map. So the areas that are in red were areas that all 3 companies were interested in. The areas in yellow are the areas that 2 of the companies were interested in. And finally, the green areas were a single nomination. You can see that we did have some interest in those deep water areas as well. So we also received 66 comments. And so on this slide, I just briefly put some things on here that we did receive as part of the comments. It's not meant to be an exhaustive list of all of the comments, just several themes showed up in many different comments. That would include removing call area A from consideration for reasons to protect the endangered roofer red knot due to fishing productivity and overlap of sea scallop fishing areas. Also high levels of vessel traffic. We also received comments that we should eliminate portions of call area D for migration conflicts, as well as removing portions of call areas E and F to protect black-capped petrels, to protect coral and offshore canyons, and to avoid interference with pelagic longline fishing areas. From some of the offshore wind developers, we received comments that call areas E and F may actually require a different timeline than those that are near shore due to the cost and the floating wind technology development. We did receive a lot of comments that we should increase our transparency in the WIA identification process, and that we should also further collaborate with federal partners such as Coast Guard, NOAA, and NASA in order to minimize the conflicts in use and to share data across our platforms. So in order to accomplish that, we developed this draft wind energy area protocol so we can have an additional way to interact with our stakeholders and receive comments. And we also are very happy that we got a chance to partner with NOAA. And I'm going to turn it over now to James Morris, who is with NOAA's National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science. Sorry, it's a mouthful. And he's going to discuss a little bit about the spatial modeling that was used to inform the decision for our final wind energy areas in the Gulf of Mexico region, and that we are also using this process in our Central Atlantic region now. I'll turn it over to you, James.
Thanks, Bridget. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's great to be with you and to talk a bit about the spatial planning work that we have done in partnership with BOEM. A couple of things I want to point out before we get started is that one is that we're excited for this to be a national partnership. We're working around the nation, providing spatial planning support between our agencies, and we are working to bring the practice of spatial modeling at regional ocean scales to be able to simultaneously understand all the different ocean features and characteristics and ocean neighborhoods around these call areas, and helping us to understand wind energy areas, where we can site wind energy areas that are optimally located to be able to minimize conflicts and ensure that conservation concerns are taken into account. So what I'm going to present to you today is the results of the draft wind energy area spatial model for the Central Atlantic. This model actually is very similar to the model that was built for the Gulf of Mexico, which you can see has been finalized and is out for the final wind energy areas are now released, or were released about a month ago there. We also have similar models underway for the Gulf of Maine and Oregon. And so this work is being replicated throughout the nation. If you're interested in following up more on this, you can see also some of these models were used to cite or provide spatial planning support for aquaculture opportunity areas in Southern California Bight and the Gulf of Mexico as well. So we are excited about the progress that's being made here. between our agencies, among our agencies, on generally on getting better at marine spatial planning. There is a whole team behind us here working. You can go to the next slide. A whole team behind us working here. We have on the line who will be helping us through the question and answer session. One of our lead spatial scientists on this project, Alyssa Taylor. She's worked hard on this process, through this process, and will be helping with the questions. I want to generally kind of show you the spatial planning process that we use to answer the questions about where are the best areas to move forward with consideration for wind development. And this is a long process. You'll notice that you first start out with sort of identifying the project requirements, looking at your area of interest, gathering your data together, developing a suitability model, and then using a cluster analysis, and then to be able to identify those areas, those grid cells that have the highest suitable scores. I'm going to walk us through kind of this model that was developed for the Central Atlantic and show you each one of these steps along the way. You can go next. So as we mentioned earlier, these are the Central Atlantic call areas. There you see they're A through F, where we have essentially some inshore areas, A through D, and then offshore areas, E and F. Next. We did separate this model into two models. Once we got into it, realizing the disparities in terms of data availability and the types of data for the inshore areas and the offshore areas. And so as we look at these modeling results, we need to remember that these are two models. We have an offshore model. All of the data are relative to each other only for the offshore areas as well as the inshore areas. So this is a relative suitability modeling approach. And so we're not looking at comparing any kind of scores or anything between the inshore and the offshore model. Each model is unique to itself. We're looking at the offshore areas, relative to each other, and the inshore areas relative to each other. All right, next. So the first thing that we do is we overlay a 10-acre grid. This is a hexagon grid over top of the study areas. In this case, we used a 10-acre grid cell size. It is that's consistent with previous regions. We have done a significant amount of work trying to figure out the right resolution for these regional ocean planning models, and 10 acres has really worked well in the past. That's based on the kinds of data that we have, the resolution of that data, and such. I do want to say that this is a fairly high resolution modeling approach. 10 acres in the ocean is a small amount of space relative to the broader ocean, but we feel like it provides us with a lot of contrast and a lot of insight into the ocean region. Next. So once we have those 10-acre grid cells, we then our ultimate goal is to produce a heat map, like the example you see there on the left. Ultimately, these heat maps are areas that we can identify hotspots of opportunity or hotspots of conflict within the area. This is a relative suitability modeling approach. So we're trying to understand in a relative sense within the study area, where are the areas that have overall the highest suitability for, in this case, the planning goal is wind energy development. So you see there on the left, you see the areas that have you see where the pipelines are. You see where some of the other sort of fixed features are. You see the varying areas of increased fisheries and those kinds of things. And what a spatial suitability model does is allows you to bring all that data into one model and be able to weight and score those data accordingly and in a relative sense to be able to understand where those hotspots exist in that ocean region. So you can go to the next slide. So here I'll walk you through an example. So what we will do first is we'll work to gather all the data that we can that is relevant to the planning goal here of wind energy development. We'll ask the first question: what are the data that are absolutely incompatible with wind energy development? And all those data we'll work through and put those in a constraint submodel. So for example, for this particular model, deep sea coral observations and sponge observations were in the constraint submodel. We also have military areas. We have shipping fairways and those kinds of things. We went through all the data and asked that question: is it at 100% incompatible with development or not? And we put all those data in the constraints model. We generally are working with a scale from 0 to 1 in terms of suitability scoring. We are going through and scoring each data layer. Scores that are lowest, closer to 0, are the ones that have the lowest compatibility. Scores that are closer to 1 have the highest compatibility. And then we'll be averaging all those scores across each grid cell and developing those sort of pictures of what's happening within the study area. So here you see examples of the constraint submodel and the types of things that went in there. The constraint submodel, you can go to the next slide, had constrained about a quarter of the study areas. So about 25% of the study area was constrained based on just those 4 or 5 data layers. And you can see where those constraints existed. Okay, next. Next, we'll gather together all the different data that represent different categories of information. And for this model, I believe we have basically about 4 submodels. Our first one is the national security submodel. And here we're going through each one of the data layers within the national security submodel and thinking about it in a relative sense, you know, with a scoring range from 0 to 1, where it fits in terms of that compatibility with wind energy development. Interestingly, these 4, in consultation with DoD and others, these 4 data layers all were scored at a 0.5, about a medium compatibility. There's going to be issues. It's going to be okay in some areas, but generally speaking, these were the general 4 data layers that went into the national security submodel. You can go to the next slide. And you'll see here where the national security concerns are, with the lowest compatibility there, having multiple data layers driving down the grid cell scores, overlapping with each other, and you see a general sense there. Not too interesting in terms of just you have these sort of broad blanket areas, not a whole lot of contrasting data, but you can generally see some general trends. Okay, the next submodel is our industry and operations submodel. Now, while you only see 2 data layers listed here, there's a whole lot of data underneath the hood here in terms of different types of industries that are happening here. First, we have the National Marine Fisheries Service independent fisheries surveys. These are historically important fisheries surveys that provide baseline information about fisheries and other types of ocean observations. We also have AIS vessel traffic. This is essentially vessels, many different types of vessels that are we can understand through the automatic identification system, the AIS system. We're using a data set between 2015 and 2021 to understand sort of all vessels traffic. Now, the AIS data represents a bunch of different industries. You're talking tug and tow, you're talking the container shipping traffic and fishing and recreational and those kinds of things. For this particular types of data, these are continuous data, which means that we could have a range of numbers of vessels traveling through a grid cell that could range anywhere from 0 ships going through a cell all the way to an infinite number. You know, thousands of ships could go through that grid cell. What we do with continuous data like that is that we will fit a function to it, where the highest amount of ships that are going through a grid cell receive the lowest compatibility score within the range that we assign it. And that means that basically the grid cells that have the highest amount of conflict are going to receive the lowest scores, and the grid cells that have the least amount of conflict are going to receive the higher suitability scores for those data layers, should they interact with those grid cells. And so let's look at the results from the industry and operations submodel. And you'll see here that there is a lot of diversity in the region. You can see where you have across the NIMS surveys and the other types of industry data that are here. You see you have hotspots of activity that's happening, in each one of the study areas, and you kind of generally get a spatial, footprint about where that activity is happening. All right, moving on to the next submodel, which is our natural resources submodel. Here you see we have 5 different data layers in here. We have some highly migratory species, essential fish habitat data. We have some marine bird information. We have habitat data, and we have our protected resources data. In some of these, we have worked to build combined data layers where we take into account multiple species. We work to provide or to obtain technical assistance from our colleagues within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as in the National Fisheries Service, to better understand the relative conservation concerns, be able to put together these combined data layers, and to be able to prepare these data for spatial planning. All of the methodologies behind these combined data layers, the species, the scoring approaches, and all that kind of stuff, is provided in the methods, for these models. And these are providing to us really first-time understanding of the distribution and intensity across the board, for example, across all species and turtles, across all types of habitats. We're able to look at it regionally and be able to understand the interactions that could happen there with wind, and use that information to be able to inform the overall decision process for siting of the wind energy areas. So let's look at what natural resources look like. And you'll see here across the region, this gives us a first picture of kind of this, where the most sensitive areas are, where those hotspots areas are for natural resources. And this is providing new intelligence, new information about kind of the regional specificity of sensitive areas for all things natural resources, taking into account habitat, coral, hard bottom, artificial reefs, protected species, marine birds, and those kinds of things. All that gets placed. Each grid cell gets a unique grid cell score, and we can compare that to the rest of the grid cells and better understand the region in terms of where the sensitive, overall more sensitive areas are. Okay, moving on to the next one. This is our fishery submodel. In this submodel is included information about specific fisheries themselves using the vessel monitoring system data sets from 2016 to 2021. That VMS data is critical for understanding fishing footprints. And then we also have the headboat survey data in there as well, representing that fishery that doesn't have VMS data. And we'll go to the next slide, and you can get to see the overall footprint of fishing. That's how it's happening here. You'll see the area A has the highest amount of fishing in it. And then we also have fishing occurring in the northern, a lot of fishing occurring in the northern part of B, as well as the western side of E and F. Very clearly indicates, there's more intensive fishing happening within those areas, and we see areas where there's less intensive fishing happening. Okay, the next submodel is the wind submodel, and this one is where it's good for wind is factored into the model as well. So factors such as distance to shore, to ports, the depth, the average wind speed. This model was only applied to the near shore model. It doesn't, the information kind of is not that good. The quality data is not that good for the offshore side. So we only applied it to the near shore side. And here you can see the results from the model run for this submodel. And we'll show you that quickly, and you get a general sense of sort of the directions that the wind submodel are influencing grid cells as well. All right, so with that, once we've run through all the submodels, we'll go to the next slide and we'll look at everything together. Here you have essentially the 5 submodels and the constraints model. And what you want to look for across here is across these different topics, where are areas within these study areas that have the highest overall suitability? Where is there blue areas that is consistent across these various sectors of the blue economy or environmental concerns, environmental interactions? And so our next step would be to calculate we use a weighted mean approach amongst these study areas. I'm sorry, amongst these submodels. So if we go to the next slide, and if you might have picked out an area that you thought had the highest suitability scores overall, this is the calculated geometric mean approach for the final suitability scores. So, and we've overlaid the constraint areas, the areas that are constrained over top of this. So here you see that area, the northern part of E. There's a little bit of blue there on the eastern side of F. You start to see some bluer areas there around a little bit in A. You get a sense of where the where the least conflicting and lowest environmental concerns areas would be over the course of these study areas. Okay, let's go to the next one. So our final step here is to use the model to go in and penetrate into those blue areas, to pull them out, to be able to apply a cluster analysis to extract those clusters that have the overall highest suitable scores. And those are the areas that we'll want to work on to better refine and better understand. And is the purpose of this call and this comment period is to ensure that we have the best available data and that we truly understand what we need to understand about those particular areas of the coastal ocean. So here you see the cluster results of that cluster analysis, and this represents the highest scores there. And you go to the next slide, and this just shows the total acreage and the how we can identify those and be able to work on characterization analyses for those specific ocean spaces. Okay, next. And this shows you an example of that characterization process, where we're able to overlay a specific data set, overlay it on top of the draft wind energy areas there. You can see those clusters there are identified by the hatched areas. Those that represent the draft wind energy areas, and we can overlay specific data layers and look at the specific interactions based on the overall modeling results, help us better understand and characterize those areas. Okay, with that, I know that was quick, and we'll hopefully have plenty of time for discussion. So we'll turn it back over to the facilitator. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We're going to go right to Bridget to continue the presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. So what we did now, we took the 15 draft WIA options that were recommended by the model. Those draft WIA options encompass approximately 1.45 million acres and or about a 62.5% reduction in our call area. So in the map to the right, you can see the blue areas are the areas that were recommended by the model that James just presented. The areas in yellow are areas that BOEM is adding as secondary areas into our draft wind energy areas. These are areas that we're just not ready to remove at this particular stage, because we think that they might be mitigatable, or because we just would like some additional comments and some more feedback from stakeholders. So overall, we're recommending 8 draft wind energy areas. So we have something in all 6 of the call areas. We have A, B1, and B2, C, D, E1, E2, and F. So overall, our draft wind energy areas encompass 1.75 million acres. And it's a 55% reduction in our call area. So just to drill down a little bit, this is call area A. You can see in the blue are the areas that were recommended by the model. So what we did here is the draft US Coast Guard Navigational Safety Fairway took up a large portion of call area A. And so we asked NCOS if they would remove that constraint, just so we could see if there's anything suitable underneath that layer. And the model did recommend the area that is in yellow if we remove the constraint of that draft US Coast Guard Navigational Safety Fairway. So because that is still in draft form, we are adding that as a secondary area just to keep it on the table at this time until we have more collaboration with Coast Guard. So for call area B, again, the areas in blue are the ones that the model recommended. And then BOEM is adding the additional yellow areas, which are secondary areas. So we have 2 WIAs in call area B. We have B1, which a total of around 32,000 acres. And then B2 is 290,000 acres. For call area C, the areas in blue are the recommended model areas, and the yellow, again, are our secondary BOEM added areas. The main issue here is that there is a portion of a NASA danger zone to the northwest corner of call area C. And so that's something that we just would like to do some additional collaboration with. So we're adding that as a secondary area, but all of call area C is about 183,000 acres. For call area D, again, the blue are the model recommended areas, the yellow are our secondary added areas, and they total 209,000 acres. So call area E is our deep water areas. We have E1 and E2. We did not add any additional acreage. The blue areas are what the model had recommended. E1 totals 470,000 acres, and E2 is 344,000 acres. And then finally, call area F, we did not add any additional secondary areas to this either, and it totals 42,000 acres. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to BOEM's NEPA coordinator for the Central Atlantic, Sarah Vaughn, who will go over our NEPA process.
Thanks, Bridget. Just a quick overview of the NEPA process. As the final WIAs are identified, that's when we're going to actually begin the NEPA process, but this is just a quick overview. NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act, and it provides the framework for protecting the environment by disclosing the decision consequences. It requires federal agencies to consider the environmental impacts of their activities. It requires the decision makers to incorporate the environmental values into the federal programs, and requires coordination with the other agencies and governments with resource responsibilities. So BOEM is going to be conducting an environmental assessment to disclose the potential impacts of issuing the renewable energy leases on the Outer Continental Shelf, and we're going to be asking for input for this environmental assessment. This environmental assessment analysis will only be for issuing leases and the site assessment and characterization activities. And those activities are things such as installing the MET buoys, the vessel trips, and the geological and biological surveys. This analysis will not include any specific project layouts. It won't include cable routes for specific projects, and it will include the visual impacts of a project. So the analysis for specific projects will be covered later in the process, after a lease is obtained and the project plan is submitted, and there will be additional opportunities for some engagement and consultation at that time. So again, the environmental assessment will be on the final WIAs once they're identified, and the EA will incorporate analysis from some background documents, and it will look at the affected environments, including the physical, the biological, and the social resources. It will look at the impact producing factors such as noise, bottom disturbances, and air emissions. And it's going to look at how each of those impact producing factors could affect each of the individual resources. And again, all of that process will begin in early 2023. That's the anticipated timeline for when the final WIAs are identified. And I'm going to throw it back over to Bridget to talk more about that.
Thanks, Sarah. So for next steps, sorry, thank you. So the next steps for our Central Atlantic project, our draft WIAs were published on November 16th on regulations.gov. We have a 30-day comment period. So we're in the middle of that now. We'll be closing on December 16th. We have 2 stakeholder engagement meetings. We did one yesterday with fisheries and related industries, and then today for our environmental and conservation organizations. Our area identification is scheduled to be complete during Q1 of 2023. And our proposed sale notice is scheduled to be published in Q3 of 2023. Our final sale notice would be in Q4. And then our auction is scheduled for Q1 of 2024. So how can you submit your feedback? Any feedback that we received today, we are definitely listening to. We're taking notes, and our facilitators are jotting these things down, and they'll be added to our meeting summary that will be placed on our website. However, if you would like your comment to be part of the official docket on regulations.gov, you can go to that website and there's a search box at the top of that page. You can just type in BOEM-2022-0072 and click enter. You should then see our draft wind energy area docket come up, and you click on that link and you just follow the instructions to submit a public comment at that time. So that website will close on December 16th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern. If you'd rather submit a written comment via mail, you can also do that by submitting it to me at BOEM's, and the address is on this slide.